Already started. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out on this beautiful day or watching from home, wherever you are. Before we get started, I'm just going to remind you to silence your cell phones because it's something that we've gotten kind of out of the practice of doing. And welcome to this evening's Saugatuck Scribes. I'm Jennifer Keller, the program coordinator here at the library. This series highlights our own Westport authors and their newest books. And these are truthfully some of my favorite events. Tonight we're hosting Ted Aldrich and Gabby Coatsworth to introduce us to their books with the help of our moderators, Tricia Tierney and Bruce McGurk. Who are these people, you ask? Award-winning writer and blogger Gabby Coatsworth presents her memoir, Love's Journeys Home Today. She spends her time reading, writing, traveling, or gardening in her flower garden, wondering whether to read or just keep holding that cup of strong English tea. During her other hours, she's working on her next novel, which we are looking forward to reading in a few months, maybe a year. When it comes out. Gabby also has the distinction of creating the first recording of an audiobook right here at the Westport Library's Verso Studios. So we are kind of excited about that one. But we're also excited about Edward Aldrich, who is the author of The Partnership, George Marshall, Henry Stimson, and the extraordinary collaboration that won World War II. He dipped into his love of history that goes back to his early childhood for this book. He has a long career in banking, working in New York, Zurich, and London, including for Oramet Trading, and The Partnership is his first book. And oddly enough, like Gabby, Ted is also an avid tea drinker and gardener. This evening, we're going to start our conversations with Ted and Bruce McGurk, whom some of you may know as the leader of the library's Pages Through the Ages book discussion group. After their short tease of The Partnership, Tricia Tierney will discuss Love's Journeys Home with Gabi, and then we'll put both authors on stage to answer your questions. And if you're at home, you can type in your questions to the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. So, after that, then you can buy books if you're here, and they'll sign them for you. So I hope you will enjoy tonight's Westport authors as much as I do. Bruce and Ted, your time starts now.
Thank you. Go. Okay, good. Welcome to the manly part of the evening. My name is Bruce McGurk. I am addicted to history, and I refuse treatment. Now, John Adams once said, and we should all know this, and he really did say this, that the American Revolution would be remembered as Ben Franklin smiting the ground with a lightning rod, and out sprang George Washington, fully uniformed and already on his horse. Now, he wasn't completely wrong about that. That is how quite a few people remember it. We tend to remember World War II as Roosevelt and Churchill smiting the ground, and out rises Eisenhower, already in a Jeep, along with Bradley, Patton, MacArthur, and if we're lucky, maybe Joe Stalin chasing behind looking for attention. But if you didn't have people like Henry Stimson and George Marshall, there wouldn't have been any Jeep. We also might have been worn out by 1942 and 43, and we might have been asking for terms. Now, Ted Aldrich over here did us the enormous favor of writing a terrific book about The Partnership, which is Stimson and Marshall, and getting it done. Now, the victors always write the history, but it's battles and blood that sell the history books, not administration, management, logistics, or supply. But that's how it gets done. So Ted, thank you, and thank you for being here. I'd like to start with Henry Stimson. Now here's a guy who is, shall we say, born into the game. His father is an enormously successful lawyer, and Henry himself is born only 3 years after Appomattox. Tell us something about him.
Thank you, first of all, and thanks for the nice things about the book. I gather my check cleared, the one that I sent you in the mail, it clears, so appreciate that. Stimson was born into a wealthy New York family, long established in the U.S. He went to Phillips Academy at Andover. He went to Yale, where he was in the famous and secretive social club, Skull and Bones. He was third in his class there. Went to Harvard Law School, where he was second in his class. Went to probably the most established law firm in New York City, where his boss was a future Secretary of War and Secretary of State himself. He was a friend of Teddy Roosevelt's. Bruce was saying earlier that he thought Stimson looked like an accountant, or a bookkeeper, despite the fact that he shared Roosevelt's absolute love of physical, dangerous adventure. And so Roosevelt, in 1906, named him District Attorney of the U.S. Attorney of the Southern District of New York, which up until then was an interesting position, but you can divide that position into anyone who served before Stimson and after, because he completely changed it. He became the top law enforcement entity in the country, and he went after the big trusts at the time. Gave him a reputation, became Secretary of War in 1911, and to give you an extent of the length and breadth of his career, when he became Secretary of War in 1911, he was, the U.S. was still fighting Native Americans, and we had one airplane in the Army. Of course, when he left years later, after his second stint, we're in the nuclear age. Then he went back and forth for the rest of his career between being one of the top lawyers, if not the top lawyer in the country, and serving the public. Under Coolidge, he was asked to troubleshoot, to solve a civil war in Nicaragua. He was asked to be Governor General of the Philippines, which doesn't sound like a big position now, but back then it was considered like a feeder into the presidency. Then he was Secretary of State under Hoover. And then he spent the next few years yelling and screaming about the dangers of Hitler in a country where people really wanted to close their ears and their eyes about that. He had a counterpart, Churchill, in England, who was doing the same thing. Roosevelt privately was an interventionist and was afraid of the war in Europe, but publicly, if he wanted to stay in office, he had to represent the majority will. But he did hire Stimson to be Secretary of War in 1940, joining Marshall, because he wanted a Republican interventionist in the office, and someone with his experience and background. So that's Stimson.
Now, how would you describe his approach to partisanship? Was he able to work across the aisle, or what was his approach?
I wish there were people like that today, but he absolutely just viewed the issue as the thing. And this is not just later in his career, but early in his career. If his party was against something, he would fight against his party. And that happened over a tariff issue, certainly happened over isolationism. He was against the New Deal, so he's a Republican in that standpoint, but he was fiercely thinking that the Republican Party dropped the ball. So it was all about issues, and he had zero problem, zero loyalty to the Republican Party if they weren't on the right side of an issue.
I thought it was very interesting also, he's arguing with Hoover just while the Depression starts going. Europe owes us an awful lot of money. France and England together owe great heaping wads of cash. And he goes to Hoover and says, cancel it. It doesn't matter. Hoover made this a campaign promise that they were going to pay their debt.
It was a big Republican issue. Hoover should have known better. But Stimson, because he was so tapped into corporate America and corporations around the world and the economies of the world, he knew that what you'd lose by canceling the debts with England and France, America would gain in just the trade within a couple years. Right. So he was very wise and learned about that stuff, and Hoover was a political issue with him.
And he has a great reputation for integrity.
Yes.
He's completely honest.
To a fault.
Okay. And he has a great ability to present an issue to get people to think about it. Terrific courtroom lawyer. Over-prepares. gets it completely nailed down. And people say that he could be kind of strange in company, and that his concentration was such he would only deal with one thing at a time. And in the law firm, he could have his associates or other partners sitting around, and he would be standing there saying absolutely nothing. And if they tried to interrupt his thought, he would just glare at them. And then finally, he'd come up with something and say what it was he was going to do. But he was absolutely flawless in getting an argument across.
Certainly the practice of the law. There's one anecdote I like to say. They were making the case for crossing the Channel into France versus Churchill and the rest of the British general strategy about more working on the outside, fighting Hitler on the fringes, the soft underbelly, so to speak.
Right.
And Marshall and Eisenhower and a bunch of their top army guys were working on a memo for Roosevelt. And Stimson just went to his office and prepared one. And while these guys were still managing it, he comes in and he hands it to them. And these guys who'd been working hours, they read it, and Marshall read it out loud and just said, "Oh my God." And they both looked at each other and just said, "This is perfect," and dropped everything they did and just took it. And Roosevelt thought the same thing, just handed it to Churchill without any edits. I mean, he really could make an argument, and that's just being in the law for 30 years.
All right, now, George Marshall. He is not exactly born in the game. In fact, I wouldn't even say he was born in the ballpark. Tell us a little bit about him.
So Marshall was born in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, small town, went through the public schools there, went to Virginia Military Institute, and then just started a career in the early 20th century Army where in peacetime you're kind of going from one remote location to the other every 2 years. You've heard, 72 moves and whatever, it's just constant. But wherever he was number one. He was number one at his school, not academically, but in terms of the discipline, and it wasn't even close. He had 0 demerits in the 4 years he was at Virginia Military Institute, and the average was 100 per year for a student. Unfortunately, he was so good at what he did that it hurt him, because every general wanted him to serve as a staff officer. Right. And in the Army, you only get promotions if you're in command of men. Even in peace, you have to be command of a fort. But they all wanted him because he was considered the best staff officer, the best teacher, and the best student in the Army. So he was always being pulled to these teaching assignments or staff. Same with World War I. He ends up performing brilliantly, but Douglas MacArthur, who started in the Army 1 year after Marshall, he was promoted to general 16 years before him, because during World War I, he got to take a few men and over the hill. And that's just the way America was. And it cursed him forever. And the reason we don't know Marshall's name that well compared to Eisenhower is because whoever was going to get command of D-Day was going to become famous. Right. It was Marshall's for the asking, but he refused to ask for it. And not only that, anytime Roosevelt or someone Roosevelt sent said, what are you thinking about D-Day? He refused to even give an opinion on it because he felt it should be Roosevelt's choice. And Roosevelt knew that nobody could do what he does in Washington. And what did he do? He did handle strategy. So it wasn't, just administrative and logistics. He handled the British. He handled MacArthur. He handled the Russians. He handled Congress, all the special interest groups. And because of his monumental integrity, Roosevelt really wanted him to stay there. So as a result, after the war, if it weren't for the Marshall Plan, we truly wouldn't know the man.
Something about VMI that struck me. Now, VMI at the time, and I don't know about it now, I thought it was a military academy. It's actually, go ahead.
Well, you're not to blame. Virginia Military Institute, right?
Sounds like a military institute.
I was surprised to learn it's not. It's when Marshall left there, he had no advantage in getting a commission than any other civilian. What it is, it's a liberal arts school that has long believed that the way to teach young men and young women today, the way to teach them is through military discipline. Right. So you have barracks and you have marching and this, but they don't even study military subjects any more than another school. And
there was an incident that took place when he started at Virginia Military Academy. that upperclassmen were hazing him, and they made him sit, as they called it, on the seat of eternity. Do you want to describe that for us?
Yeah, I think it might have been
Infinity, sorry.
Yeah. So it was hazing. He was being hazed, and the bayonet of a gun. You're supposed to lean over it, and he had suffered scarlet fever or something right before he came. That's why he was late, and he kind of fainted and got a huge gash on his backside, and everyone would have been. All the students at hazed him would have been kicked out. So they interrogated him about what happened, and he made something up completely. And
He just said it was an accident, I
yeah,
felt.
and no one touched him after that, and he was defeated by the...
And even at the time, he said that he knew that if he was going to succeed in the military, he had to garner respect and leadership, and that meant not too much familiarity with anybody.
I would say no familiarity.
No familiarity.
He was almost like George Washington, had the same self-design. George Washington famously wrote down, what it takes to be a leader, and one was don't get close to anyone.
Right.
Be formal, be distant. He wouldn't let anyone ever call him George. And one time Roosevelt made the mistake of calling him George. And Marshall looked at him with a death stare, and that everyone who worked for him knew, and Roosevelt never called him that again. He never went to Hyde Park. He didn't accept Churchill's invitation to Chequers, the British Prime Minister's country estate, and never had a drink with Roosevelt. He just always thought, no, keeping it formal will command respect, and people did respect him.
And two more things. When Stimson was leaving the Pentagon, which was built by a decision by one of Marshall's staff, I believe, the last day he was serving, which was also, I believe, his birthday, Marshall brought him out to the airstrip where they were going to fly back to Long Island, and Marshall brought out every single general that was available, I think to the tune of 120, and had them stand in the hot sun for about an hour waiting for Stimson to show up so we could shake all their hands and give him a real send-off, just to show the respect they had for this man.
It certainly was. I mean, these guys worked side by side in offices where the door was always left purposely open the entire war, and they were doing that for two reasons. One, they talked 4 or 5 times a day, so it's just practical, and they're both practical men. And the other reason, they wanted to send a message to their respective staffs that there are no secrets between the military and the civilian authorities during this war. And they developed this really intense relationship, one built on trust, candor, which is not always that comfortable, being completely candid with someone. They had to have some real heart-to-hearts. And the reason I know all this, and the reason that writing this book was easy, is because Stimson kept a diary that was 4,000 pages just during the war years. And he would write down all his feelings in all these meetings. So an intense, I should have used this in the book, but there's this expression, we went to war together. They literally went to war together. And so that day you're referencing, he had turned 78. Truman had finally let him retire. The war had ended a month earlier. He had a heart attack the last week of the war. And he had to attend a cabinet meeting that day because he was arguing, speaking of trust, he was arguing that the world, and the US rather, should share the nuclear secrets with the Soviets and everyone else because he felt like the Soviet Union was going to get those secrets soon enough anyways. And he was correct. 2 years later they had the bomb. He's like, why not give everyone that now, and let's talk about the peaceful use of nuclear bombs. So this meeting was delayed. Marshall surprised him by getting the Army band there, 125 generals, Stimson's staff. And I think it wasn't just their relationship. He was again trying to send a message to all the generals saying, look, World War II is over. We're heroes. Our reputation will never be better. But he wanted them to keep in mind that what had made America great was that the civilian authorities always are above the military authorities. So it was a touching story in so many ways. Yeah.
And these guys took us from a situation where at the very beginning of World War II, we have a couple of tanks. The Germans have thousands. We have 170 men under arms, poorly trained.
170,000.
170,000.
That would be really bad.
170,000. Poorly trained. And the Germans have more than...
They had 5.5, 6 million. That excludes the Air Force.
Right.
And that our 170,000 included the Air Force.
Right.
And we had 300 workable planes, the Nazis had 10 times that amount. And they had 2,500 tanks, as you mentioned. We had so few tanks that when they were doing these war maneuvers in Louisiana, where Eisenhower first became famous within the Army, they had to take old pickup trucks and write the word tank on the side for their war games.
Right.
Yeah, we had nothing.
And Stimson passes away in 1950, I believe.
So he had a heart attack
Yes.
the last week of the war. It didn't kill him, but it definitely slowed him down. He retired to his estate in Long Island, and yeah, he just slowly kind of faded away and died 5 years later of heart failure.
And then in 1953, Marshall was asked to do one more service for our government.
Yeah, I tell this story in the book because it shows one of the qualities of both men, but particularly Marshall, was humility. And the day he retired, he was looking so forward to retirement. In fact, he asked, after we beat Germany and we were still fighting Japan, he asked Truman, can I leave? Because he and his wife had all these plans to drive all over the country. And Truman said, no, I want you to stay on for a few more months. So he did. And then the day he retired, he raced to his little home in Leesburg, Virginia, and his wife and he sat on the porch for a second, and then his wife said she was going to take a nap, and she went upstairs, and when she was upstairs, the phone rang, and it was Truman. This is the day he retired. And Truman said, General, I want you to go to China for me. And Marshall didn't want to wake up his wife. He said, yes, sir, and hung up. And his wife came down an hour later, and the news was on, the 4 or 5 o'clock news at the hour, and the guy on the radio says, and in other news, President Truman just announced General Marshall will be going to China. And his wife is like, how long have I been asleep, you know? And he then had 7 more years of service. The last service he did was Queen Elizabeth II's, coronation. And it's amazing this woman's still alive, by the way, considering Marshall did this so many years ago. And he was kind of old and frail at the time, and he's walking into Westminster Abbey down the aisles with General Bradley. And he notices aisle by aisle as he walked by, people were standing up and applauding. And he leans over to Bradley and kind of whispers to him, who are they standing for? Who are they applauding for? And Bradley kind of chuckled and just said, for you, what do you think? And he had no idea. That's how humble he was, you know. So.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
It is a wonderful book.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, my name is Tricia Tierney, and come from not being out of my house for 3 years to being on a stage in front of. Thanks, Gabby. I've many years and still work for Barnes & Noble and around books, and for many years ran the author events there, which is how I know many of you. And so, yeah, it's fun to be back on this with a very dear friend, Gabby Coatsworth, to talk about her beautiful memoir, Love's Journey Home. And I guess I'll just launch in with the first. Love's Journey Home is indeed a journey. It takes us through territory that none of us really want to ever travel. And unfortunately, I think throw a stone and we'll hit someone who has, between addiction, illness, cancer specifically, divorce, and ultimately death. So a lot of grief, and yet Gabby navigates this road and takes us, the reader, along, and we come out the other end at peace. And I think you do too. So I think I want to lead in with that as the first question, to talk a little bit about how you navigate that in life and also through the writing of your memoir.
Well, thank you. First of all, I want to say the book is not quite as dire as that sounds. Because people who know me know I have a sense of humor, so, and that is one of the things that helps get me through. But what fascinates me when I talk to people about the book is that everybody finds something different in it that they can relate to. It is true that in my life I've more or less had I tell people I've got one of everything in my family. You know, I've got a bipolar son, I've got an alcoholic husband, I've got whatever, you know, all these things. But what I needed to do, my husband died after having cancer, and before that, we'd been on the brink of divorce. And so what I needed to do after he died was to figure out, was it really a love story? Did I really fall in love with him? Was it the real thing back in 1974? Or was it, you know, a Hallmark movie, which it isn't a Hallmark movie because real love isn't. And that's why I started writing it, really. And I urge anybody who wants to figure out what the heck their life has been about to do the same thing, because it was incredibly helpful to me.
So kind of the second to that question, which is, do you think writing the memoir changed the way you saw your past and your marriage?
Yeah, yes, it did, because as I said, I had all these questions. The fact is that, in a funny way, my husband and I fell in love again when he got really sick and he had to give up drinking alcohol. And he turned right back into this guy that I had fallen in love with so long ago. And what that meant for me was that it's almost cheesy to say it was a happy ending. You can't call it that, but it was, it brought my life to where it is today. And as you can tell, I wasn't born here. You know, you might have guessed. But I came over to work for 6 months, and I'd already met this guy in London years before, and then we got together again, and he lived here and I lived in Chicago. All these things, I was like, how did I get here today, having been to all these other places first? And so I started writing down what I remembered, the things that were the most vivid in my mind. And then I started to put the correct dates on them, because I was getting in a complete muddle. But it helped me to sort out the trajectory of my life, the path, the journey. And now I feel that I understand myself a lot better. I don't know if you'll understand me a lot better if you read the book, but perhaps you will.
So in talking about, so yes, this is a book, a memoir of a marriage. Looking back, do you think you would have done anything different in your marriage?
Oh, gosh. You know how you know everything when you're 20? Yeah, I just kept right on knowing everything all the way through, and getting it wrong and getting it wrong and getting it wrong. And eventually, after you've made the same mistake enough times, you start to figure out what my part in it was. And when I look back, I don't like to feel that I have regrets. And I'm here today talking to you about a book. I never thought I'd have a book published at this venerable age. And yet here I am. And so I don't have regrets about my life. I can suggest to other people ways in which they can improve a similar situation based on my experience. But it's too late to change that for me. So understanding myself, and hopefully other people who recognize something in this book that applies to them, or that gives them the idea that, oh, maybe this isn't quite as disastrous as we thought. Maybe there are ways through it. There are always ways through it. You know, it's just a question of putting that one foot in front of the other, I think.
So do you believe in love at first sight?
Well, as an old lady, now I would say, of course, it was just physical attraction at first sight. But the fact is that it was so strong that I felt like I'd recognized something in this man. He was an American, and there was just something about it. He recognized something in me, and I recognized something in him, and I can't explain that. And he lived in America at the time, and I was in London, so we actually got to know each other through letters. And that's it's a wonderful thing. Letters are a wonderful thing. It's not emails, you know, and it's not texts. And I still have those letters. And so I recognize the truth of them. Yes, I was a romantic, of course. Who wouldn't like to be in a romantic relationship? But I don't regret being a romantic, you know? I don't regret my life, really, and I hope that's reason enough to say, I don't know, I don't want to say I did it my way because I don't feel quite like that about it, but yeah. That probably didn't answer anybody's question, so carry on.
Are there any memoirs that inspired you or were a kind of blueprint for this?
Okay, so I'm going to tell you a funny story. I started writing this, and a friend of mine is very good friends with the PR director of Knopf Publishing. And so one evening over pizza at my friend's house, she introduced me to him and said, and Gabi has written a memoir. And I thought, this isn't going to go anywhere, obviously. So he looked at me very kindly and he said, so were you beaten as a child? And I said, no. And I said, I haven't been abducted by aliens and, you know, I'm not a celebrity. And he said, oh, you know, so I didn't read any memoirs because they only discouraged me. I read a couple, you know, by celebrities or by people who sort of had been abducted by aliens. And I just thought, I can't compete with this at all. So my friend said to me, why don't you just write it as if nobody's ever going to read it? And that's what I did. So this is the result.
Did you enjoy the memoir process, and can you imagine writing another one?
So I got stuck halfway through the process because people who didn't know me very well said, you've got to bleed on the page. And I was like, hello, I'm English, we don't bleed on the page. And also, of course, I started feeling incredibly sad about some things. And I was just like, I can't keep going. And then I remembered my friend's advice, you know, nobody's going to read it, she said, so write it that way. And I did. That enabled me to finish it. And then, you know, I switched it around. The beginning, that's the beginning now. Any writers here will know you never start at the right place when you're writing a book. So I had other people read it and tell me where they felt things were missing or where I should do more. And yeah. And then I put it sort of aside. And my other friends kept saying, so this memoir you wrote, like, what happened to it? I said, so you are going to publish it, it will get published? And finally I just said, oh, you know, I have to. There's something about finishing a memoir that's like drawing a line under something in your life. And that is another little hurdle that nobody warned me about. But no, it's all okay.
Did it draw a line? Do you feel
it helped me? You know how when someone asks you to tell them something about yourself, and you nearly always, I do anyway, find myself starting with the same thing. And the same thing in my life that I always start with was, well, I grew up in London and my father died when I was 12. And it never occurred to me for years that this was how I saw myself, as the orphaned child. And it wasn't until I started writing this book that I realized that was my story. And so using love to come home to myself in a way was how I was able to heal that orphaned child. And I wasn't going to talk about this. What do we do?
Lovely, it's lovely though. It sounds...
So, and I've forgotten what the question was. But, oh yes, so that having your own story to tell is important. And when you've had as many years as I have, you can't tell it all in 5 minutes. So you pick out the highlights, which is sort of what I did here. But since I've written it, some people who have read it have asked me, you know, would I like to write some more about my childhood? I'm like, okay, well, that's like history, so possibly I could, you know, so far back.
So how does writing, for example, fiction, how is that, because you're working on a novel, how does that, can you...
How's that different?
Is it a field different? Is it a different process for you?
Yes, it's a different process. So I've written a couple of novels, and I wrote them by just telling myself the story, which without really planning it out, and then trying to superimpose a plot structure on it afterwards. And I have an agent who said to me, do you think you could write a cozy mystery, a high-concept cozy mystery? I had to look it up. She said, you know, like a gardening club that solves murders. I said, well, you know, I've never written one, and I read them for relaxation, but I never guess who the murderer is. And so I said, well, you know what, I'll take a class. And the first thing I realized was, you absolutely have to start with the plot first. You can have your characters, but if you don't know who did it before you start writing, you're in trouble. And you have to know where to make things happen and so on. So when it's your own story, things just do happen, and you try and arrange them in the book in a way that makes sense and gives a little light relief sometimes, and so on. And you can choose, because it's a real story. But in fiction, I think these days that it's better to have something of an idea of what the hell you're doing before you start. But you don't need to with memoir, so go for it.
So I recently heard this expression, that a plotter versus a pantser. So as a novelist, you're a plotter, but as a memoir writer, you're a pantser. Is that it? Pants by the seat of your pants. Is that correct?
So I refer to myself now as a plantser, meaning I do some of each. And I don't know, it seems to work for me. Everybody's got a different way of doing it. If you ask the memoirists who are here in the audience, they would tell you that they did it quite differently from me, and they're very happy with what they got, right, Diane? Yeah, so we all do it the way that we think is going to work.
So you wrote, and then you went back and broke it into chapters and decided to do parts. There's a part one,
right.
a part two, and a part
I
three.
took out so much of it too, because didn't need it all. And I've got that though. If you like this one, I may force it on you later. But no, so yeah.
So can you talk about the part one, part two, part three? It's pretty...
Oh, so I didn't really know what the theme was at all when I started. I was just writing it for myself and then showing it to friends who were helping me make it better writing. And I realized that what it was my life as love related to my life. I didn't want to write the story of my career, or, you know, the story of what it was like to adopt two little boys from England when they were 5 and 8, or any of... I didn't want to write those kinds of things separately, only as love came into it. So that was my theme. And to begin with, I started writing it, and then I thought, oh, I've got to put some background stuff in here, and I better put a bit more in here. And then I realized I was getting confused. The poor reader would have had no chance. So I changed it and made it chronological, which means it starts in 1974, really. I know, I feel so, yes. Anyway, historical, as I said. So it starts then and it goes through to now. So obviously huge amounts of it are missing. But that's why I divided it into 3 parts, which was the romantic part where everything was lovely and, you know, and then the marriage part where things begin to raise their heads and you sort of wonder whether you were right in the first place, but you're not going to give up and you keep on slugging away. And then the last part, which was where my husband got very ill, and I knew that if I wanted to have any chance of reconciling with him and feeling okay about my life, because I had left him, that I had to go back and look after him. And I'm not the only person to say that this turned out to be one of the most rewarding experiences. It's not something I would willingly wish on anybody, but if it had to happen, I was very lucky that it happened with this man that did turn out to be the love of my life.
So my opinion is that Jay, your husband, would be very proud of you, having read it and loved it. But what do you think? What would Jay have?
My earlier writings were quite often humorous essays about Jay, because one thing about him was that he did have a sense of humor, so no matter how tricky life could be at certain points, I could always tease him about it. So and every time I wrote something and got it published about like how crazy he was about ice cream or whatever, he was perfectly thrilled and would tell all his friends. You know, his wife, the famous writer, had written this all about him. So yes, he was always proud of me and proud of any of the work that I did, and very supportive of me having a career. So yes, I think he would like this. I will say, people wonder what families think about your memoir, you know, and I wondered too. So my daughter, who's sitting over there, is in the book, and at the beginning of the book, or after we got married, there's this part about how she drove us all crazy. She and her brother decided to, you know, we'll show them, taking us from Chicago, bringing us to Connecticut, and so on. And I thought, she's not going to like this book. But as it turned out, she's one of my staunchest supporters, and she's been absolutely terrific. And by the way, the photograph on the cover is one that she took, the view from our house in New Hampshire. And but the grandchildren, so they looked at it and they went, so how many times am I in here? And I'm like, and sort of, they range from 16 up, you know, in years. And I said to the 17-year-old, I said, well, hang on a minute. I think you're in it, here you are twice. He said, do I have a line? I said, yeah, you know, you have 2 lines. He goes, okay, what about Ellie, his sister? So I'm like, oh, God. Ellie's in it twice. He goes, does she have a line? She only has 1. Woohoo! That's all he wanted to know, that he'd got more lines than his sister. I don't suppose he'll ever read it, you know. One of my granddaughters did read it, but said she couldn't read the sad parts, which was fine. And she's my daughter's daughter, and I think she has some insights on her mother now that she might not have had before. But anyway, everybody is still speaking to everybody else. So
I have one last question, and that's, you recorded your audiobook here.
I did.
And can you talk a little bit about that
I'll
for
just
our
say
finale?
I'll just say a small thing about that. So with Memoir, you know, people like audiobooks these days because they can listen to them in the car or whatever. But with Memoir, most often people record their own books because you've written it and you know how you want it to sound, and it's extra important that, you know, it comes over the way you want. And I didn't have any idea how to go about this. I tried it at home. The minute I started, the leaf blowers would start outside the window, you know, so this was going to be hopeless. And I looked at a couple of places, and then I remembered that the Westport Library had this studio, but it's magnificent. I mean, they could put an orchestra in there, you know, so I thought it's too much, but I thought, I'll ask. And to my surprise, they said, sure, we'd love to do an audiobook, because they hadn't done one. And so I came rather nervous, and every time I did get nervous and my voice would sort of dry up, Travis, who's lurking around up there on that balcony, would say to me, so shall we just do that one more little time? And I'm thinking, I thought I got away with that, but no. People who have listened to the early, people have downloaded them already from online, and they say that it's come out okay. So I was absolutely thrilled to do that. And if I have future books with British heroines that require a British voice narrator, I will certainly come here and do another one, because it was pretty much painless, which is great. All tribute to Travis and his team.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You stay right where you are. We're going to bring Ted back up on the stage. And if anybody has a question for either one of the authors, we have a microphone over there so that everyone will be able to hear your questions. So don't be shy, because that's why we're here. I do have one online that's sort of for both of you. Well, I'm going to just lob it out to both of you. Obviously, these two books are very different. There's a history that's packed with all sorts of facts, and a memoir, which is also packed with facts, but personal facts. Can you talk a little bit about how you go about choosing which facts to put in? I'll start with Ted. We'll start with Ted.
I guess one goal was to try my hardest not to bore people in the book, because some facts can be boring, so you're going to prioritize the important ones. I mean, I wish I had a more creative answer to that, but to try to keep the facts that are really important ones, prioritizing, and it reminds me of an anecdote that Bruce mentioned, the Pentagon. Reading Stimson's diary every day, he was working on all kinds of things, so there were all kinds of facts I could include, but one day, this is to give an extent how important his work was, he'd written 4 or 5 pages of all the problems they were having that day, and he ended by saying, "Oh, on another note, I just approved the building of the Pentagon. I think it's going to be a good thing." The Pentagon's still the largest building ever built, and he devoted a sentence to it with a semicolon, and I just thought, similar to that, I just try to include the important things.
So my motto for writers that are writing memoir that stupidly ask me for any tips is, don't let the facts get in the way of the truth. And by that, what I mean is that if any of you have got siblings, you know that if you start talking about something that happened in your childhood, they will immediately go, no, it wasn't like that, it was like this. And that's the thing about memoir. It is about what your memory can bring up. And what I tried to do was to be truthful. I never deliberately changed anything, but I'm sure my sisters haven't read their copies yet in London. And I'm waiting for the phone calls. What do you mean, But you can do that with memoir, because what's important is the emotional heft of a memoir, not so much whether I got the date right of a certain event,
We have a question in the audience.
Of course. Gabby, as one of the members of your glorious writing group on Monday mornings out at Pequot Library, it's just fantastic. You're always the first one to get to work and the last one to look up at us. And I was wondering if you could share with us what your next book is about, and that you've accomplished writing this incredible memoir, which gives us such a view into who you are and the high standards of you living your own life, how that is going to follow through, or how it's helped you, or how it's impacting your next writing.
Okay.
No pressure.
Yes.
Do you want me to answer that for you?
That's a simple answer. So I've got a novel that is ready to go to a publisher, and that one is the story of a 50-year-old widow whose friends keep suggesting that it's time for her to get a new man, and she really doesn't want to do this, and so she reluctantly looks at an online dating site, and then a voice behind her as she's looking goes, "You can't go out with him, he's 70 if he's a day," and it's the ghost of her dead husband. And the reason that came to my mind was because, yes, I had all these friends going, "Wouldn't you like to go out with, wouldn't you like another man?" And I was like, please, it's been so much work. And then, but also, well, what do you think happens to people if there's no heaven, And my real answer to that is that I think that people live on in us as long as we live. People have not gone. But I also think that sometimes I do sort of see my husband, And so I turned it into a character in the book who's quite funny, in fact. And it's totally lightweight women's fiction, the sort of thing you take to the beach. because that's what I felt like writing. And as you know, over the last 2 or 3 years, we've had enough stuff that we need distraction. So I started to write it as a distraction while I was waiting for the memoir to be accepted or not accepted somewhere. And the next novel is perhaps going to be the one with the mystery heroine. I don't know. I'll just keep writing.
And Ted, do you have another project lined up?
I don't. I wish that, like movies, that books, you could do sequels. I would just try to do a second one in this, but I don't have anything lined up, no.
Okay, do you have a topic, though, that when you do get the time that you would want to dive into?
I think as a theme, one of the reasons I enjoy doing this book, I do like writing about people that should be more well-known than they are. Ron Chernow, 20 years ago, wrote a book on Alexander Hamilton, and people have heard of Alexander Hamilton, but I read it 20 years ago. I'm kind of mad that Lin-Manuel Miranda kind of stole him from me, because I felt like I discovered him myself, and I would tell anyone I could, this guy's the greatest there ever was. And then I liked that a lot. So when I found this topic, I knew I had something, because these guys, I was looking around, I just couldn't believe they weren't better known for their accomplishments. So it would be under the same kind of theme as that. And plus, I do like the dual biography concept. Mm-hmm. I think it's neat to talk about relationships and some kind of a team approach. So I just need to find two people.
Great. In the audience?
Hi, Teddy.
Hello.
I have had the pleasure of knowing you personally over many, many years, and I remember very distinctly you mentioning that you were writing the book many years ago. You already had this project in process. What has kept you going with this? Because I know it's a long process. You're enthusiastic about your main characters, but like many, many years keeping your focus on that. Can you tell us about your motivation?
Thank you for the question, Frederick. And I did tell you a long time ago, I started this book in 2011, and I am a banker by profession, and I read a lot of books over many years on the train, and with the infrastructure degrading in Fairfield County, and I know the guy who's selling my books, Will Haskell, is trying to fix that. But the slower the trains went, the longer I had to read, and I wrote the book on the train, back and forth each day. And to answer your question, and even my family members don't believe me, if I never got this published, and you perhaps feel the same way at the memoir, I didn't quite have the same approach, that I didn't think anyone would read it, but it was like, when I have a great book, I never want it to end, even a history book, like a 1,000-page book. Similarly, this was such a deep dive, it was so fun to do, so I never got impatient about doing it. It was so fun to write and to learn about something that I thought was fascinating. I often say to people that don't really love history that history is just like fiction, except it happens to be true. And that's the case with this. So it never got tiring, Frederick, and I really loved working on it the whole time. It's almost sad when it came to an end. It took, I guess, 8 years to write.
Okay, we'll have one more quick question.
Okay, well, it's a two-part question. I just didn't get a chance to ask Ted. Would you tell us a little bit about Stimson's and Marshall's approach to stress and their work regimen? And also, if these men are products of their time, where do we find people like this today? That should be an easy one.
Yeah, I'll answer the first one. They were way ahead of their time. They believed their bodies were machines. They exercised every day. They got plenty of rest and sleep, and they're constantly trying to advise their guys that you need sleep, exercise, and rest. Marshall wouldn't make a decision after 3 p.m. They didn't work like those masters of the universe on Wall Street 18 hours a day. They went home at 5 o'clock because they knew they were sharp when they got sleep, rest, and to de-stress. Marshall rode a horse back when you could ride a horse around Washington every day. Stimson did the same thing and played lawn tennis at night. So they were just obsessed about taking care of their mind and bodies. And the second question, where do you find people? I had a conversation with Bruce yesterday in preparation for this, and he mentioned Joe Ellis, who was an author of a book called The Founding Brothers, and I think he taught at Mount Holyoke, right? Joe Ellis? My sister and mother who were here went to Mount Holyoke. He wrote, what's the name of the town in Pennsylvania? He said that the population of Virginia in the 1700s, mid-1700s, was the size of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania today. Yet they produced Jefferson, Madison, Washington, George Mason, all these, Patrick Henry, all these guys. He said, why is it that, how could that happen? I can't explain it. Maybe those historians you cited before about, maybe it's true, maybe it's from Franklin's electric rod. I don't know where you find them, but it's, we're very fortunate. Maybe it requires a big crisis, and the Revolutionary War was a big crisis, and the World War II was a big crisis. Maybe that's it.
I want to thank both of our authors today, Gabby Coatsworth and Ted Aldrich, for their fascinating books and their time tonight, and our two moderators, and for all of you joining us this evening. Remember that you can purchase books this evening, or you can take them out from your local library. Either one.
Or you could purchase.
Well, I said that first. And you can also listen online to one of them. So definitely check out these two books. Keep watching for more Saugatuck Scribes events, and I hope we'll see you soon. Thank you so much for coming.